Pep Guardiola, Mikel Arteta, Xavi Hernandez, all of these great managers are using box midfields at the moment, and the big question is why. But before we can answer that, we need to understand what it is that a box midfield is. So on the board in front of me here, I've got Chelsea as they set up under Thomas Tuchel. Seems like a really basic 3-4-3 shape here, but actually the two wide players in the front three actually tuck inside quite narrow. What this allows is for your wing backs then to just push up into these areas here, and you end up with a de facto front three here. And what we get, lo and behold, in the middle of the field here, the box shape with our midfield. This is what we mean when we say a box midfield. What we've got is a double pivot, and then two 8s or 10s in this instance in the wider iteration here. Now, if we're coming up against a back four, we get all of the advantages that you see from positional situations. So for example here, the two 10s can attack these areas in between the fullback and the centre back. You've got the wing backs in the wide areas and then a centre forward in this space here as well. But in the central midfield area as well, we can see that Chelsea are going to end up with an advantage because they've got 4 midfielders, and most of the time you would expect them to come up against 3-man midfields. What this does is that means that you're going to have more players around the ball in the middle of the field. It'll be easier for you to retain possession of the ball, easier for you to move the ball down the field. And the other advantage that you get there as well is because you have a free man, that you can move that free man out in certain phases of play, maybe drag opposition players with you, but you also know that by moving out of this area, you're still going to match up the opposition player for player in this sort of area. Another team who use a box midfield are Arsenal, but they end up moving into a box midfield shape very differently to the way that Chelsea did. So here's Arsenal on the board, 4-3-3, nothing like what we saw Chelsea in, but actually they're going to end up in the same sort of shape by pushing their front line forward. So you've got your front line of 3, and then what we're going to see is the 2 8s pushing up. And now Zinchenko is going to push up alongside Thomas Partey. The rest of the defence will shuffle around, and you've got your back 3. And lo and behold, here's our box midfield again. Now, Arsenal are forming these situational box midfields because they want to get the same sort of tactical advantages that we saw Chelsea getting, that is having an extra man in the midfield area. But there is another level here, and this is a level which is dependent on the idea of positional play. Now, we talk about positional play a lot. We usually talk about how positional teams like to get players spread across the line of the field into the different channels that exist. So we have a central space, we have 2 half spaces, and then we have 2 wide areas. But there's lots of different facets to what positional teams are trying to do. So I've got a quote here from a guy called Marti Pirano, who's done a lot of work on Pep Guardiola, and he talks about an aspect of positional play that we don't talk about too much. It consists of generating superiorities behind each line of pressure. Now, superiorities simply means just getting an advantage in some way. Usually that means by getting a player into an area where they aren't marked, or maybe getting more players than the opposition have in a certain area as well. But superiority is really important here. Or to put it in another way, and this is the simplest idea here, create free men between the lines. So Arsenal are forming a box midfield in some respects because they want to use it as a tool to be able to generate space in behind lines of pressure, generate areas that their team can exploit. So let's go back to Arsenal on the board. We've got Zinchenko here inverting inside, making this box midfield for Arsenal. And as we can see, they're playing against a 4-2-3-1 in this instance, and that means that they have the player overload here. Now, in principle, the idea is that Arsenal should be able to possess the ball easier because they have the extra player here. And what they're going to try and do is move the players of the opposition around into such a situation as this, where they actually generated this player here. This is a superiority behind the line of pressure. This is a free man between the lines. If they can find Xhaka in space here, they're going to be able to attack much better. Now, obviously, Zinchenko has inverted from outside, so you might expect that the wide player on his side might follow with him. Now, in these sorts of situations, Arsenal can still use various positional advantages to move players around, generate space. One of the things they can do here now is move the ball out to Gabriel in the wide area, and because that wide player has moved inside, this midfield is now pinned to Zinchenko, so there's space that's opened up in this wide area here which can be exploited. What we could see, for example, is Martinelli dropping in, maybe dragging a player with him, but then what we've done is generated a weakness here where Arsenal can start getting a superiority. For example, Xhaka could pull across here. Space now opens up here. Jesus could drop in here. So what you're doing is by moving players around, by manipulating space, you're able to get those advantages. Another way that Arsenal could exploit this situation is that rather than the ball going out wide to Gabriel, they could actually have Xhaka pulling out here, dragging his player with him. This creates space in between the lines that Gabriel Jesus can drop into, and Zinchenko could find him here. And then again, you've got this superiority where you've generated a free player in between the lines that you can then use to exploit the opposition. And this is why Gabriel Jesus is so important to Arsenal, because he's so good at using the spaces that open out in this midfield area and exploiting them. So Arsenal are a team who use a box midfield to generate certain advantages on the field, but not every football team who's using a box midfield is using them to generate those specific kind of tactical advantages. And this brings us to Barcelona. So here's Barcelona on the board. They're in the same 4-3-3 shape as Arsenal. They're going to arrive in a box midfield shape as well, but they're going to do it in a very different way to Arsenal, because rather than trying to solve a tactical problem, what they're trying to solve is a personnel problem. How do you get Pedri, Busquets, De Jong and Xavi all into the same team sheet? These are four of the best midfielders in the world. Xavi wants to get them all on the pitch at the same time. How is he going to do it? And the answer to that question is a box midfield. Now, whereas Arsenal are forming the box midfield by moving the fullback inside, Barcelona are doing it in a very different way. Rather than the fullback coming in here, it's actually going to be De Jong who's going to drop alongside Busquets and form the basis of this box midfield. Now, by De Jong dropping out from this space here, what he's doing is generating an area for Xavi to move inside to. Xavi is leaving a space then that Balde can move into. And then we've got our front three here, Dembele, Lewandowski and Balde. Our box midfield here, and then the back line can just shift around to give us our back three as well. So we've ended up with the same shape that we've seen in all of those box midfield structures so far. Back three, a box, and then a front three. And we've solved our problem of how do we get all of our great midfielders into the same midfield structure. So what does this look like in reality? Well, we've got Sergio Busquets at the base of this box midfield, playing the role that we know he plays so well. So he's going to be involved in the build-up. He's really good press-resistant build-up player. He's also a really important defensive stopper for them as well. Now, Frenkie de Jong, as we know, is a player who likes to drop in, help out with the build-up. So he can drop into this back three if he wants, help out if the opposition are pressing particularly high. But he's also a really great ball carrier as well. So he'll be able to get forward into these channels. He's able to evade pressure really well, and is a really creative passer when he gets there. Now, with Xavi over on this side and De Jong over on this side, moving into the same sort of space, Lewandowski also likes to drift across onto the left-hand side as well. What we end up with is a natural overload in these sorts of areas from Barcelona, and what this allows Barcelona to do is overload to isolate. So when you have a player like Ousmane Dembele on this sort of area, you can move everyone across onto this side, protect the ball, build up, and then float the ball across to him, get him isolated 1v1 against a fullback. He's a brilliant ambidextrous player, ambipedal player, ambidextrous player, and he could go either way around the opposition fullback and either get to the byline and play the ball back to all of these players running in, or he can cut inside and shoot from the edge of the box. And so because Barcelona like to play this overload to isolate on the left-hand side, Xavi gets a lot of good players around him. He's a really good close ball player. This really suits his skill set. It also allows him to get into the front line of the press as well. He's a really brilliant presser of the ball too, so it's great to have him in this sort of situation. And then Pedri on the other side is playing a little bit more of an isolated role because he is on the right-hand side and everything is tending over to the left. But Pedri is a good enough player to be able to play an isolated role. He can help out with Dembele, he can drop into the wide areas here, or he again can pick the ball up and recycle it over to the other side as well. So Barcelona have used a box midfield to solve a personnel problem, but the big question is whether or not that box midfield gives them the tactical advantages to perform at the highest level, to get more out of their players when they are on the field. We've just seen Barcelona get knocked out of the Europa League by Manchester United, who are the better team across two legs. And this does raise a question whether or not this structure is actually allowing them to be more than simply the sum of their parts. So many teams are using box midfields in football at the moment, but there is no one-size-fits-all box midfield. Many teams are arriving in those box midfield shapes through very different means. And most importantly, just because you're using a box midfield doesn't necessarily mean you're getting all of the tactical advantages that a box midfield can offer.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.